Maybe we can open it up to the audience now for some questions. And so we have one microphone here, and I will hand over the microphone to folks who have questions. Try and keep it short, please. You have a lot of hands up.
I read the book, I'm a child of a Holocaust refugee, number one. Number two, I read a book many years ago by Robert Morse called While 6 Million Died. So I was interested when you said 1325 was a state codified in 1929. So is there a relationship between, I don't know if you read that book, but I mean, there was a heck of a lot of, I don't know if you'd call it quota laws, or, you know, I'm sure they had the names of the Congress people that did it regarding the anti-Semitism in the 30s and so forth. What is the relationship, if any, to 1325 and the shutting of the doors to the European Jews? Or is there a connection between 1325 and that?
There's not a lot of scholarship on that. I've looked into that a little bit. I've not read the book you're referring to, but there's some indication from my reading that the 1929 law was a compromise, believe it or not. It was a compromise between the real anti-immigrant extremists and the more business-minded politicians in Congress who wanted more open borders for labor purposes and such like that. So the 1929 law, they wanted to shut down, they wanted to tighten up the quotas even more. And they wanted to completely black out entire countries, probably an entire hemisphere if they could manage it in 1929. But what emerged as the compromise bill was what we have now, which was not to completely shut it down, but just to penalize people as much as possible for attempting to come. And I won't go into this too much, but the gentleman, historically, you have to understand, to understand the 1325 law, you have to understand this gentleman named Coleman Livingston Blease. He was a one-term U.S. Senator from South Carolina, and he was a self-described pro-lynching Democrat. And he had some very colorful things to say about certain racial groups. For example, when President Hoover and the First Lady invited a black couple to dine at the White House, Mr. Blease stood on the floor of the Senate and said, used the N-word and said, on the floor of the Senate, and said, they call it the White House for a reason. Whereupon one of his colleagues, also a racist colleague, he was so inflammatory that even one of his fellow racist colleagues moved to strike the statement from the record. That was Mr. Blease, and he was the prime author of the 1929 law. In terms of the quotas, I won't go into this in detail, but the quotas came into existence in 1924, so just a few years prior to the law we're talking about now. That's when they began. The quotas where they were severely limiting Southern Europe, i.e. Italy, i.e. Catholics, and limiting Eastern European immigration, i.e. Jews. So I think there probably is some relation there. I don't know the full extent of it, but certainly temporally, 1924, you had the quota system, which was certainly designed targeting two specific.
Way before the 30s.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Isabel, you want to address that issue?
I just want to make one comment about not only 1325 and 6, but any of the sort of restrictive and punitive measures that we have in the laws are used during economic turmoil, times of economic turmoil. You can see during, the 30s, the 20s and the 30s, they in the 50s, Operation Wetback. Anytime there's economic problems, we have blamed the immigrant. It's not the first time. I urge you to look that in terms of our history. And so we believe that, businesses have been in cahoots until the economic restructuring taken away some of our business people that used to be on our side. Now, the economic restructuring has led for even more insecurity. And I'll tell you, a lot of the business element, they've wanted workers and such, but it's better to have them without status because that way they can't organize, they can't demand. We have all that.
Okay, another question. Yes, over here.
In short order, in a few bullet points, can you tell us what you want us to come away from here and how we can help?
Yes.
Good point. That was. Thanks for prompting me on that. Isabel and I, the reason why we focused on 1325 is because we believe when we talk about family separation, we should stop nothing short of calling for the absolute abolition of the law. So we should go back to 1928 when it didn't, before it existed.
Not everybody prosecutes migrations across the world.
Yeah. And so that's our ask. If you're talking to your federal legislators, mention to them that 1325 ought not exist, that its very origins are illegitimate under our current day legal analysis. If you were to pass a law today with the floor statements that I read at the beginning of my remarks, I think it's highly probable that law could be struck down as unconstitutional because it's expressly motivated by race. So Isabel and I, we talked about this because we want the ask to be abolished 1325 from the books. Short of that, we have some other tweaks to 1325 that we think could make things a little bit incrementally better, but why stop short? Just abolish the darn thing. And then on the local level, because I wanted to, if you look at number 10 of our talking points, I didn't want to omit the responsibility that our local electeds have on this issue. We've talked, I know that a lot of Arizona ground game is about state issues, and so I didn't want to overlook that. And while it's true that this is a federal law enforced by federal officials in a federal courthouse, and people are sent to federal prison, that does not absolve our local elected officials from responsibility and complicity. So for example, if you have a local sheriff's deputy who pulls somebody over for speeding, and in the course of that traffic stop, that deputy discovers that the driver might not have lawful status, and the sheriff deputy calls Border Patrol to the scene, and there's evidence that maybe that person is not only undocumented, but that at some point, maybe 10 years ago, they came to the country by doing what Isabel mimicked. It's highly likely that that sheriff's deputy is contributing in a very real and tangible way to the criminal prosecution under 1325. So on the local level, we want to ask you to raise, if and when you talk to your local officials at the county level, the sheriff, Board of Supervisors, we want you to raise this issue that what they're doing is tied to 1325. And then don't forget at the state legislative level, because I know all of you are seating according to your legislative district. In Phoenix, we still have this thing called SB 1070. And what does SB 1070 require of our local police? SB 1070 still 8 years out. I don't want to underemphasize this. 8 years out, SB 1070 still requires local police, under some circumstances, during a routine traffic stop, to quote-unquote determine the immigration status of that driver and sometimes the passenger. And so those are three things. Federal level, you're talking to your federal legislators, abolish 1325. You're talking to your state legislators, abolish SB 1070. And if you're talking to your county level leaders, like the sheriff, implement policies that prohibit or severely limit their ability to interact with Border Patrol and ICE.
Donate to the ACLU.
So, I think there's a lot of things that we need to do, both long-term and short-term, right? Short-term, I think we have to demand that ICE be out of the jail. ICE has to be out of the jail. They never had a desk before. It's encroaching. They call it the whole of government. It's encroaching so that every level of government has to act for the Border Patrol. They've admitted it. We've got to stop Stone Garden monies. We've got to. That's September the 4th. We cannot let Pima County continue to be part of this big brother, the Border Patrol incourse, because they have the fancy gadgets, they have a lot of money. But I'll tell you, their prevention through deterrence is really short for three things. There's death. Our prevention through deterrence, that's what they call it, the militarization. It's death. We've painted over 3,062, and now we got to add the New Year's. And that's not enough. Death and disappearance. The more wall you build, the more you disappear. Death and disappearance. The other thing is we prosecute you. You heard it. We're at 52% of our prosecutions are of this, and now it's growing. And the other is separation, the whole social death, right, that we call the separation. That's what our prevention through deterrence policies are, and this is part of it. We have to stop this prevention through deterrence. You should go to Operation Streamline. If you're really interested, you should come to our great End Streamline Coalition group who produced the leaflet I hope you guys picked up. An organization that's been monitoring what goes on every single day, monitoring different things as conditions have changed, because we have to end Streamline. We have to end the prosecution of entry. We have to stop all the cooperation, whether it's SB 1070 or the local thing. And really, we have to think a little, and we have to get to McCain and those guys. They're lying. They're lying. It's almost embarrassing to read their letters where they tell their colleagues in the Senate that Yuma needs Streamline because they used to have all these crossings, and now look at, they don't have, I don't even know how they can do it with a straight face. Really a lot of ignorance or a lot of interest in money interest in all of this. But I want to think big. We need to break up Department of Homeland Security. We do. It was the worst thing that happened to us. After 9/11 in April of 2003, they combined, 27 federal agencies, and we knew it was going to be bad. The level of transparency, accountability, it's moved more militaristically. Our Senate and Congress are every day moving that ODHS has to cooperate with DOD. We have to stop this. Yeah.
Thanks. Isabel and Billy, I'm wondering if you can talk about the kind of mundane practices of family separation that currently happen. And I guess maybe related to that, if you could talk a bit about the consequence delivery system and some of the different components in that. And I'm thinking, in part, the connection between lateral repatriation and kind of long-standing practices of family separation. If you could maybe just speak to that a bit. Thanks.
The latest, first I want to recognize that family separation in different forms has taken place for years and decades, in different formats. For example, in the classic case of mixed status families that consist of one or more members who are undocumented, one or more members who have some kind of legal status, maybe U.S. citizenship. So there's been forms of family separation for many years. But in terms of how it's worked in the past 6-8 months specifically, since it's been hot and heavy in the news, it works like this. You're apprehended crossing what we call EWI, so entry without inspection. So in other words, crossing through the desert. You're apprehended by Border Patrol with you and your child in tow. You're taken to the closest Border Patrol processing center, which could be 20, 30, 40 miles from where you're apprehended. You're fingerprinted, your child is fingerprinted, you're taken basic biographic information is taken from you and from your child. Most of the parents that I've spoken with directly have with them the the home country birth certificate of their child, and their oftentimes their own birth certificate, their photo ID, so they can prove the familial relationship. So this whole, one of the things that many of you may have heard in the news about how the government's not trusting that most parents are actually the parents, that's a bunch of crap. Because most people I've spoken with have actually come with documentation on their person. So they show that documentation there at the initial processing center, and there's a few variations from this point forward, but the common story is this. You're put into a cell, after your processing, you're put into a cell there in that facility. You might spend one night, maybe 2 or 3 nights in that cell together with your child. You're probably told, with your child there in front of you and listening, you're told upon processing that you will be separated. So there's some psychological trauma right off the bat. The child may spend an additional night or 2 or 3 nights with you, but the child in most cases has heard the immigration official tell you that you're going to be separated. Then the night comes. It's always the night. It's never the daytime, because they want to catch you when you're not completely coherent, you're sleeping, and they rouse you from your sleep, and they pull typically both of you out, you and your child, out of the cell, and at that point they forcibly remove you. They put you, and then after the child is removed from you, they put you into a different cell with all single men or single women, as the case may be. And the child is then taken off, and you're not told anything more.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of lateral repatriation. During the summer in particular, allegedly because they're concerned with the horrific conditions in the desert, they have a big budget to do what's called lateral repatriation, and that's what she was asking about. And so let's say you're arrested here and ordered to be deported, and they decide to deport you through Mexicali. And those are lateral repatriations. Do you know what that does to families that have no idea where their family members are? I recall speaking to one gentleman who could never find his wife, and this was several years ago. Before this, she spoke an indigenous language. They separated them. He was transported also to Mexicali by plane. You know, there's contracts. There's an industrial complex building here right along the border, and that's part of it. And so the other gentleman that we knew about, we were at one of our annual pilgrimages, and we had the pile of, almost 2,000 crosses, and we saw a woman looking furiously through the crosses. And so we approached her, and she said that in 2009, Pima County Sheriff racially profiled her brother, who had 3 U.S. citizen children, had 3 jobs, racially profiled, turned over to Border Patrol. They did a lateral repatriation, and he died in his attempt to come back. We have valued community members who this social separation, this social death has resulted in real death, and it happens a lot to a lot of people, and so it's a matter of life and death is what we're doing here, and this lateral repatriation all feeds into it. When we saw it was already climbing before 2014, but we saw the exodus of children. We saw Central Americans, parents so stressed about their children, they sent their children unaccompanied, right? We had that issue of unaccompanied children here. And we have that issue that we have to deal with. It's not just the ones that were torn away. These were, of course, through the psychological and the torture I can't even imagine. And I just read about the Texas case where these guys were organizing to perhaps have a hunger strike and visit with the Raíces attorneys. And they came in like a SWAT team and separated them from their children, and then eventually brought them back. I mean, that's torture. How is it that we're allowing this to happen? I'm sorry, I don't know if it answered your question, but...
Another question? Yes, sir.
Is there a statute of limitations on some of these offenses?
Statute of limitations on what?
On these offenses?
Is the statute of limitations on any of these offenses?
The statute, I'm going to focus on the felony because that's the horrible one, right? Not only do you have a felony, face 2 to 20 years, but it's so easy to prove. You just have to sit here and be found guilty, right? If you go. Oh my goodness, what was that? So in these cases, the Ninth Circuit has said that your identity is never suppressible. Remember I told you about the case of illegal entry, and I proved to the judge that they did not advise my client of his right to remain silent, and therefore those statements should be thrown out, right? And I won that because they violated that, right? If they violate my rights, we had a client, also a father of a very valued member here, who was roughed up, and they took his ID, and the Ninth Circuit said your ID is never suppressible. So in a sense, it's a status offense. So if you were deported, it doesn't matter when, and you're found here, technically you're guilty. So it's pretty interesting. I don't know if usually the people that they're charging with the re-entry is somebody that they've come across. So I don't know. In New York, I know there's been an uptick in these cases. In LA, there's been an uptick in these cases, but I'm not sure. Since we deal with people that, have just crossed and that sort of thing, I don't know what's going on in the interior.
Yeah, I think the answer is there effectively is no statute, and we know of many cases where people had crossed illegally 20 years ago and are being prosecuted today. And as Isabel points out, if you're apprehended in a place like New York, the statistical likelihood that you crossed 2 weeks ago is much less than the likelihood that you crossed 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Questions? This section over here. Pass that.
This is a bit of a leading question, but can you talk a little bit more about what is going to happen on September 4th and how people can get involved at the Pima County Supervisors meeting?
So there's, as I mentioned, a lot of the policy making on immigration is surprisingly made at the county level. Not all the action is at the state or federal level. September 4th at 9 a.m. at the county supervisors building on Congress, there's going to be their regular every 2-week meeting. But on the agenda for September 4th is the topic of Operation Stone Garden, which I won't go into detail here, but suffice it to say that it's a federal grant program that is offered to the local government by Border Patrol. And it encourages local law enforcement to entangle themselves with Border Patrol. It looks on the agenda they're going to decide whether to reinstate the funding. It's been on hiatus. It's been on hold for the past 7-8 months. But the ask there is frankly to continue. Ask the Board of Supervisors to continue withholding that money because that money really has no tangible beneficial purpose. It's really designed. It's $1.5 million almost, designed to enlist the local police, the local sheriff's department as an extra hand in Border Patrol. Also, in discussion that day, very likely will be the discussion of whether or not to kick ICE out of the jail. So physically prohibit ICE officials from entering the premises of the county jail on 29th Street. So that by prohibiting them from accessing the facility in a physical way, it will eliminate one more way that ICE can screen and identify possible people that they want to deport who wind up in the county jail. And it's not an insignificant number of our community members who are getting caught up, by the way. That's about On average, we believe about 400 people a year, 400 local community members per year who are picked up and taken to the county jail being administered by the sheriff's department, and they might be there on relatively minor criminal local charges, anything from drug possession to you got in a bar fight or something, and because of that relatively minor infraction, you might find yourself in a life-altering situation of deportation by virtue of the sheriff's department allowing ICE to come in and interview you and determine that you are deportable.
Can you say again the time and place of that meeting?
Yes. 9, maybe we can write it. I don't know if that's helpful to write it, but 9 a.m., September 4th, which is this upcoming Tuesday. Wait, is that right? This upcoming Tuesday? No. Week and a half. 2 weeks, sorry. Today's Tuesday. 2 weeks to the day.
People can talk.
And yes, and people can, if you have never been to the meeting, it's a great opportunity for direct democracy. You have, each person can say can speak for up to 3 minutes on any topic. You can talk about the streets in your neighborhood if you want to, but we prefer you to talk about our talking points. But it's a wonderful opportunity to get up there and speak for up to 3 minutes.
They've got millions and millions and millions of dollars, and they're asking our forces to be force multipliers. That's what 1070 requires, allegedly, and now this as well. They're becoming force multipliers. So the Operation Stone Garden funds are dirty money. We should not be taking that money. We've heard testimony from many community members who testified about going through the checkpoint and being harassed by the Border Patrol, going through and then getting stopped by the sheriff after the sheriff calls them in their little radios that they provide them to and say, see if you can stop this person. We can all have pretext stop. If you follow any one of us around, you can try to find an infraction of some kind, but we need ICE out of the jail. We need to reject the Stone Garden monies, and some of us should go to the Border Patrol forum that the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce is hosting at 12:30 to ask questions, because it's pretty outrageous. Border Patrol overview at the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce on Monday at 12:30. Somebody's got to be there asking questions. Some of us may have to be out there protesting, but what an outrage. The Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, especially after the murderous consequences delivered by these guys.
So we've hit 8 o'clock, and first of all, I want to thank our fabulous panel. And I was counting, and there was about 100 people in the room tonight, and I want to thank you for coming out and showing just how important this issue is to the community here. I want to thank the organizers and everybody here tonight. Thank you.